Thank you all for tuning in. I'm Srimati Sridhar with the World Bank Group and delighted to have with me Gwen Hines, who is the Chief Executive Officer for Save the Children UK. Gwen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks very much. Delighted to be here.
So tell us a bit about Save the Children's work, especially as it pertains to social protection programs and cash transfers.
Sure. So social protection and cash transfers are a really key part of our toolbox. As Save the Children, we have the ambition that all children survive, they learn, and they're protected from violence. And we work directly on those areas. But what we found is that more and more families are hit by shocks, whether that's COVID, whether that's get caught in conflict, displaced, but also things like climate shocks. And so social protection, cash transfers are something we try to provide to families at a time of crisis, but we also see them as a safety net for families, for households that can be there, can be dialed up to support them when shocks hit. Child benefits are also a fantastic way to invest in children, especially the first 1,000 days. Children are the future of human capital, as the World Bank says. So social protection is really key to do that. And we saw during COVID, many governments use social protection as a way to provide extra support to families in crisis. And it's something, as we look to the future with more and more crisis, we believe will become even more important.
It's amazing. You have some cash transfer programs in Yemen and Somalia. Can you tell me more about those?
Sure. So in those two countries, it's a classic case really where you've got families struggling on an ongoing basis. If you think of Yemen, it's one of the toughest places in the world to be a child right now. You've had the conflict going on for years. People can't actually have their own livelihoods, grow their own food, health, education, very, very disrupted. But the level of hunger and malnutrition is very high. So we're providing cash transfers at scale. About 50,000 children under 5 we're helping through the programs that we've got. And so it is cash, and that gives the families dignity to choose how to use that money. But it also comes with something we call Cash Plus, which means it comes with advice, with support on things like nutrition. And what we've tried to do there is also link it to things like livelihood support, work on things like sanitation, hygiene, behaviour change to go with that as well. So it really is providing that all-around support for families in Yemen. Somewhere like Somalia, similarly, really persistent crisis. What we're seeing there at the moment is famine-like conditions. We've had the worst drought in 40 years. We have hundreds of thousands of children at risk of dying from hunger, from malnutrition. And so cash transfers were a really key tool to support their families at that time. Obviously, on top of that, you provide targeted malnutrition support to make sure that they don't die of hunger, but really expanding that is something we see as very, very key. And Somalia is somewhere where we've been working with the government to help design a system. We've seconded 10 of our technical experts to work with the government and to think about more and more, how can you design these systems to cope with shocks? We know that Somalia is hit by shocks very regularly. We've been working there for many decades, so we've got 30 years of data of how do families adapt when crisis hits. At what point do families find they're having to sell the animals? The kids are dropping out of school. So how can we design a system that copes with as many of those shocks as possible so that we can really provide that protection to people?
So I want to also talk about a project you have in Nigeria, because you've got something called child-sensitive social protection programs there. Tell me more about that.
Sure, so it's one of my favorite. In fact, there's some brilliant evidence behind it.
Okay.
It's called a Child Development Grant Program, and it's been so successful that the government is now scaling it up in Jigawa State. And in other states, we're also talking to the government about the right to this kind of Child Development Grant Program. And what it does is it targets mothers when they're pregnant, when they're breastfeeding with young children. And so that's a very easy, transparent way of targeting support. And it's both money, recognizing poverty is a really key vulnerability for families, but also it includes things like advice on nutrition. And what we've seen is that stunting has come down in quite a significant way for families helped. And stunting is obviously a really big challenge. We know if kids are stunting, that affects their long-term development, but we've also seen the diversity of the diet improving. And that again is a really important thing for children's future development. And it's also been something which has helped to think about the future investment in those children. You know, children are an asset for all of us. So how do we do that? So as I say, it started as something that we were doing at Save the Children. We're working very, very much with the government, with other partners, the UK government, the EU and others, to think how do we turn that into policy change and practice on a much wider scale.
Some prime benefits for human capital there.
Absolutely.
So Gwen, you recently penned a blog where you spoke about the need for a bigger World Bank. Tell me, how do you think we make that happen?
Well, there's a lot of very smart people coming up with all sorts of ideas about sweating the balance sheets, capital adequacy, guarantees, all these things. I've served as a member of the board of the World Bank. I used to work for the British government as a shareholder. Now I work as a partner with the World Bank. So to me, what's really key is to think about, of course, the World Bank must do far more on the climate crisis. We believe very strongly it's a child rights crisis. If the children don't have a future because we don't have a viable planet, that's a problem. And the World Bank Group has a very key role to play in that. But at the same time, the needs of governments to invest in health, in education, in social protection we were just talking about, in poverty reduction, these things are also incredibly urgent. So we need to expand the resources available to the World Bank Group. And as I say, there's lots of ideas out there. Definitely we can do more to leverage the balance sheets, but we also need governments, shareholders to invest more in the World Bank, to give it that financial firepower, particularly to help poorer countries, low-income countries, who don't have access to the credit markets, who can't use domestic taxation. The other thing we need to do is we need to look at where those resources go. Having access to resources is one thing, it's incredibly important, but we need to also be tracking where the resources go. Are they going to the places where they're most needed, across, between countries, but also within countries?
Measuring the results.
Exactly.
So Gwen, you are doing some amazing work tackling so many tough issues and challenges. When you think about the state of the world today, what gives you hope?
So I think you have to be an optimist to be in this kind of work. Otherwise, we all would have given up a long time because we see the worst crises around the world. I've been in Lebanon recently, seeing an economic crisis there, the earthquake that happens, the reversals we've seen during the COVID and then after that. It really makes me sad because we were so off track already on the Sustainable Development Goals. But what makes me happy is knowing we can make progress. Before COVID hit, we knew we'd halved child mortality over the last couple of decades. Child poverty has come down hugely. More kids are in school and are learning. What we have to do is get back on track. And the really nice thing about my job is I get to sit with kids around the world, and kids are kids wherever they are. From my own kids, kids in the UK, kids when I was recently in Uganda. That creativity, that determination, that joy that kids have.
And the innocence, right?
They do. And last year we interviewed 55,000 children from around the world about what they want in the future. And they were spot on. They all said we need to do more about the climate crisis and inequality.
Wow.
But they want to believe in a better future. And I think as adults, sometimes we look about the future as how do we make it less bad?
Yeah.
They want a positive future, and it's our role to get behind them and to do that.
That's amazing. So there is work to do, but it's work that we can do.
Absolutely.
Well, Gwen, thank you so much for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
Thank you all so much for tuning in. That was Gwen Hines, Chief Executive Officer for Save the Children UK.